Today is Friday, January the 14th, 2011. My name is Clint Risner. I will be conducting this interview. Our subject of the interview is Mr. Saul Wald, and the place of the interview is at the JCC, Jewish Community Center of Dallas. And Mr. Wald, I am going to let you begin with your reading of I believe, an autobiography.
I would like to preface this entire situation by giving a bit of an insight as to how, where, why, and under what circumstances I happen to be ensconced on this planet. And I'm going to read from the very beginning of my autobiography. Fact is stranger than fiction, the story of my life. The statement that is often made by people under the most trying of circumstances, and sometimes when facing the ultimate demise, is that their entire life flashes before their eyes. Since I have been either blessed or cursed with what has been considered a better than average memory, I find myself with the ability almost perpetually to recall the past, most of the time in vivid color and surround sound. Although this condition certainly keeps me from being bored, it nevertheless does call me to sometimes wonder if perhaps my circumstances are more trying than I perceive them to be, or is it that my ultimate demise is nearer than I would want it to be. Either way, food for thought can be disconcerting. Now that the above, hopefully pertinent information has been made available for all to see and to absorb in varying degrees of perplexity, I will try to recall, to condense, to put into words on the printed page, the interesting and sometimes unbelievable portions of a yellow brick road that is more than 90 years long. This journey could start with, quote, "It was a dark and dreary night," because it was, in fact, a dark and dreary night, and a very cold night at that. It was winter, it was Moscow, it was Russia, it was March 19, 1920, and it was soon after the revolution, and almost everyone was revolting. If I had been given a choice, I would have at least chosen another place, if not another time. The communists were in power, so obviously there was very little food or heat or transportation. Actually, the only reason for having been born into these conditions is that my mother was there. My parents and my sister, who was 8 years older than I, were living in a furnished apartment that was about 3 blocks from the Kremlin in Moscow. Now the stage is almost set for my arrival. My mother tells my father that it is time to go to the hospital for delivery, as she leaves my sister, Faye, with a neighbor. My father goes to find a horse-drawn sled, a taxi, which takes about an hour to locate and to direct to the apartment. At this point, one must note that the telephone was not used to call for a yellow cab. Although there was actually a telephone in the hall of the apartment house, there would have been no way to call the driver, who would have been standing somewhere on a street next to his horse and warming his hands over a steel drum with fire in its belly. The fire in the driver's belly was due to vodka. And if it were possible to call for transportation, or anywhere else for that matter, the telephone would have been out of order anyway. When the 3 of us entered the dimly lit, cold hospital, my parents were informed that it could not have been a worse time for a delivery, since there was no heat in the hospital. My parents were told that although my mother's life could be sustained under heavy quilts, a newborn would not survive the bitter cold below freezing temperature in the hospital without heat. They were told that heat could be provided if wood or coal was brought to the hospital to burn in the delivery room furnace, since the hospital had run out of all fuel. What was being experienced was the communist law of supply and demand. The communists demanded that all of the supply went to the Communist Party. What to do? Obviously, my father had no wood or coal, and there was no place to get these items, especially at midnight. Without elaborating on a good story, let it suffice that on a dark and very cold night, some resident of Moscow who lived close to the hospital lost his wood fence. If caught stealing a fence, the punishment would have been death by firing squad. As you have guessed, the wood burned and I was born. That night, my parents gave me life twice. I survived, and the rest is, as they say, history.
That is classic. Thank you, Mr. Wald. Now we're going to proceed with the interview. And first we're going to talk about your family, your parents. Where and when were you born? How did you happen to settle in Dallas? What did your parents do for a living, Mr. Wald?
What was it last?
What did your parents do for a living?
Oh,
This is your family. Tell me about your family, your parents. Where and when were you born, and how did you happen to settle in Dallas? And what did your parents do for a living?
well, I have informed you of my very earliest time on Earth. At that point, there was no recognition between the United States and Russia, so there was no legal way to get to the United States. My father, who was extremely vocal in his hate for communism, was not a very welcome person in communist Russia. He was, before we left Russia, he was arrested for his views. He was taken to the infamous Moscow prison called Butyrka. He was tortured. He was beaten. This was supposed to be an interrogation, and we thought we would never see my father again. And it was a wonderful feeling to have him brought back to us, even though the conditions for his return were a little stringent. He was pitched off like a sack of potatoes off a flatbed truck the following morning. At least we had him back with us. So plans were being made to leave Russia one way or another. It was either that or the firing squad. Enlisting the aid of a high-ranking communist official who wanted to defect. He is the one who devised the plan that if my parents' families in the United States would deposit a sum of money with his relatives on the outskirts of Berlin, Germany, he, after leaving Russia, penniless because they never allowed him to take any money on a government trip that he would be taking, when he would be advised that the package from America had arrived, he would be able to get us a visitor's visa to Cuba, which would be as close as he could get us to the United States. That's how we happened to wind up in Havana, and we probably would have remained there if my father hadn't become very ill in Havana the Cuban doctors didn't have a clue as to what to do for him. He was close to death, and it was imperative that he somehow would be able to get to the United States for treatment. Meeting some people through newly formed friends in Cuba, we were put in touch with a certain Central American consul who had a little business going on the side, smuggling people into the United States. He got us into the United States. The reason we came to Dallas is because although there were relatives of my parents in New York, in Atlanta, in New Orleans, all of these places were ruled out for one reason or another. Some of them because they were port cities and the government was always looking for boat jumpers. So it was safer to be inland. And since one of my mother's brothers was living in Dallas with his wife and daughter, Dallas was chosen as our place. So that's how we wound up in Dallas. And the next question, I believe, was what did my parents do for a living?
In Russia, yes.
Oh, in Russia?
Yes.
Oh, well, that's very interesting. Because having been what the communists classified as a bourgeoisie, which is a self-employed money-making individual, which is outlawed from the beginning. He had to make a living for his family, but he wasn't allowed to work anywhere because of his former status. Well, he had to make a living somehow, so he devised a business. It's odd to report that two of the most desirable items that he could get to sell in Moscow were unbelievably lighter flints, which were not available, and sewing needles. Now, these items were chosen because they were very small and very light, and they could be imported as a piece of mail from Germany and from Poland. And he was certainly not allowed to import anything. All this was a crime. And these items had to be delivered to his clientele in Moscow, and the form of delivery reads like a fairy tale. His transportation was a bicycle, and he was an expert cyclist from his very early years. My sister by then was 7, 8, 9 years old when this enterprise was going on, and she had a big, beautiful doll, which doesn't sound like an interesting fact, but it develops into something quite interesting. My father used to make his deliveries to his clientele by bicycle. My sister would ride on the rear luggage carrier of the bicycle. She carried her doll, always, because the doll was the cash register. The warehouse for the items that he was selling was the pillow on which she was sitting on the luggage carrier on the bicycle. And she was well trained for delivery purposes, and she was a very bright child all the way through her later years. She had a wonderful mind. She was trained, and she was trained to be a deterrent to possible arrest and conviction, because the money that was collected by the sale of these goods, the doll had an opening in the back, and the money would be carried in the doll's torso. and Faye was supposed to cry loudly and scream if anybody even touched her doll, which would have been the way a child would react if a stranger grabbed the doll. This went on for several years until it became impossible to continue without being found out. So that was the early beginning of it. After that, when that enterprise came to an end, one of the reasons it came to an end is because my dad was beginning to attract attention with these daily rides on the bicycle, always with the child in the back, and he put a bunch of hooks around the luggage carrier and hung a bunch of home items like pots, pans, frying pans, that kind of thing, as if he was moving to some other location to not raise the specter of possibly being arrested with merchandise. It was quite an institution. The fact is, and I'm sure that people who hear this biography might even recognize the name of Sergei Kusevitsky, who was and still is, after his death, a well-known figure in worldwide music. He was a conductor. He left Moscow, he left Russia under the guise of a world tour to spread communist music the world over. All he wanted was to get out of Russia. He never came back. He was allowed to actually own an apartment, a very modern apartment by the standards of the day. My father, who had by then amassed quite a bit of money with his underground operation, bought his apartment. We moved in to a fantastic apartment on Lagaveshchinsky Переулок, which was the terminology for a side street just off Tverskaya Ulitsa, which was the main artery in that area. And that's where we lived from the time right after my birth until I was 9 years old, and we left God-forsaken communist Russia.
So what was your neighborhood like in Moscow?
Which neighborhood?
In the apartment that you
Oh,
lived
it
in?
was fantastic. To this day, I don't quite understand how he wasn't apprehended for even buying the apartment. Now, what was my dad involved in after the bicycle operation? He met a gentleman who was a chemist. The chemist was forced, under the terminology of hired, by the communist government to develop a chemical used in the production of piece goods, wool material. A very caustic chemical product that was used in the manufacture of wool material for the purposes of cleaning the fiber from which it was made. And the communist government was paying him for his work in this cave-like factory, no heat, dirt floor, and he, knowing that my dad needed to be involved in something that he could make a living out of, he hired my father as an assistant chemist in his operation. My father had no knowledge at all of chemistry, but the government needed the services of this friend of my father's. They didn't question my father's inability to be self-functioning in this endeavor, and they actually produced a lot of good chemicals, and both of them used to burn up their clothing with this constant exposure to the caustic elements of the chemists, of the chemicals. And that's what we were involved in. My family was involved in until the day we left.
So you lived in a nice neighborhood in Moscow.
For the last 9 years, yes. The apartment was fantastic. It was on the third floor of this apartment building, central steam heat, a tremendous attic where people actually were able to hang their laundry for drying purposes. Sometimes they were brought into the house like steel sheets because they froze in the attic and had to be thawed out after they were brought into the apartment. That was not much of a handicap by comparison.
Let's get back to Moscow. As a child, what did you do for amusement there those 9 years? So,
amusement. The children, especially my age group, children of all ages as a matter of fact, were outside summer, winter, spring, and fall because at that point it was considered mandatory that children were out in the fresh air as much as possible. There was a churchyard a block and a half away that had a tremendous churchyard, and it was constantly full of kids. All sorts of games. Some of them were stupid enough to lick a metal post with their tongue, and they would immediately become permanently attached. They would have to be separated by dripping warm water to separate them from the metal post. And as many times as they were told not to, they always wanted to experiment. So that was the entertainment. Of course, during the summers, we always left Moscow and went usually to the Black Sea, the Crimea, for 2 or 3 months. That was a wonderful vacation. I, for one, enjoyed every minute of it. What's the next question?
This was regarding amusement. So you had...
We went to a lot of movies, very early movies, of course.
Concerts?
Concerts.
Ballet?
Everyone is aware of the Bolshoi Theater. The word Bolshoi merely means big. So the big theater in Moscow, yes, we had been there on some occasions. The entertainment that we enjoyed the most is the proximity of family, which obviously we lost that portion of it. My father had brought his sister, brother-in-law, and their 4 children to Moscow from Poland. And they were a wonderful group of people. We enjoyed each other's company tremendously. And we had my father's father there, my grandfather. And it was heartbreaking to leave those family members when we had to leave Russia. Entertainment, by and large, was what you made for yourself.
I see.
I just had a flashback. I had several friends about my age in Moscow, and our entertainment was stopped short by the police department there because there was a great big wooden fence across the street from our apartment, and we decided that by the use of magnifying glasses and involving the rays of the sun, we could burn anything we wanted to into the fence. And I suppose these days we would call it graffiti, but we pretty well burned the heck out of that fence over a period of time. That's entertainment.
It's excellent. Very
Oh,
interesting.
entertainment, of course. Ice skating.
Okay.
I was thinking of that more as sport than as entertainment, but it certainly qualifies
Sure,
for both.
amusement, yes.
I became a pretty good skater by the time I was 9 years old, and darn good at skiing. And one of my favorite endeavors in the cold of winter, that beautiful cathedral that everybody is aware of in Moscow, that was built by Ivan Grozny when he was the Tsar of Russia, which, as a sidebar, it's probably known by a lot of people that he used a German architect for that construction, and that no sooner than that beautiful cathedral was completed, he had the architect's eyes removed so he would never be able to.
I'm aware of that.
Oh, they were wonderful people.
So you became a very good ice skater then?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, that led to my instructing skating at the Dallas Ice Arena when it opened in 1941.
Okay. Mr. Wald, let's go to the area of education. Tell me about your experiences in school in Russia, where activities, your interests, your grade school, your high school. What did you do after high school or college? Where, when, and what did you study?
I can sum that up rather easily. In the first place, my education was constantly interrupted. Sometimes children in this country might lose a half a grade or be set back temporarily because of a change of schools, because of a change of cities and states. My changes were not only curriculum, they were changes in culture, language, and everything else. It was like taking a fish out of water and dropping it into something else. And every time I changed locales, I lost a grade. I thought I would be an old man before I got out of grammar school, because I lost in the first place, in Russia, school started at age 7, not 6. I was a year behind before I ever got started. Then I lost a year in Havana. I lost a year in the United States, and it was hard to make all that up.
Now, in Russia, in grade school, what was it like?
Oh, it was pure hell.
Okay.
Lunches consisted of mostly potatoes, I did not see a piece of white bread until I was 9 years old, and that was in Riga, Latvia, on the way away from Russia. Because all the bread I ever saw was dark bread. And in school we were fed Russian pumpernickel, which was full of sawdust. As a filler, had to constantly pick pieces of wood splinters out from between teeth. But their belief was that since wood comes from a plant, it ought to be edible. So we had quite a bit of that, and cabbage soup was a staple, but it was more water than anything else. It was always pink because they put in a little bit of tomatoes in it. And it was not a balanced diet, that's for sure. I was always thankful for my mother's wonderful cooking ability.
So you left Russia when you were in about the second grade then, right?
Yes.
Second or third grade, okay. Where did you go to high school? So
Well, in the first place, when we came to Dallas, oh, and I must inject this bit. We went through hell as illegal aliens in the United States. For 14 years, we were afraid to be found out. We were in constant fear of deportation.
And what years were those?
31 through 45. There was 14 years of pure misery. When we finally got our first automobile in 1937, which was a used 1935 Ford, and I was the only driver in the family, I was absolutely in constant fear of going through a stop sign, possibly running a red light, or what's even worse, being involved in a fender bender, which would take a police investigation. And this is really an oddity in my life. We were all in deathly fear of being in the company of any law enforcement individual, being always fearful of being found out for 14 years. And what was the business I wound up in? Police supply and equipment.
Okay. So,
where it was the most enjoyable business I could have ever been in.
okay. Now back to your high school years. Did you go to high school in the United States?
Yes, Forest Avenue High School, Dallas, Texas.
Okay. And what years were those?
35 through 39. 35 to 39.
And you graduated from high school?
Graduated from high school.
Okay. And when you graduated from high school, what did you do after graduation?
Couldn't wait to get a job that would pay me something from which I could subsidize my family's livelihood.
Mm-hmm.
The first what I thought was going to be a steady job at that point was with a wonderful institution called Lion Auto Parts and Manufacturing Company. And I am still friendly, very friendly, with descendants of the people I worked for in 1939. That job almost didn't last longer than just 1 week. I thought I was being hired in a permanent capacity, and I was informed at the end of my first week that all I was hired for is to unload freight cars, and they were all unloaded by the end of that week, and my job was over. And it was just a wonderful thing that Maurice Polikoff, who was the local manager of Lion Auto Parts, overheard this conversation between the office manager and me and came to my rescue. He told Charlie that that is not the way to hire people. Give them the impression that they were being hired as on a permanent job and terminate them after a week. He turned to me and he said, "You're not going anywhere. You did too good a job the first week." And I was with them for quite a while.
Great. Regarding your childhood, did you have any Jewish affiliations? Did your family belong to a synagogue in Russia, or was that permitted under the communist regime? And what was the extent of your
it would
family's
not have been
participation?
permitted, and we weren't, and we wouldn't have, but my grandfather, my father's father, who decided to become quite religious in his later years, they did allow one synagogue in Moscow to be open. And that was not because they wanted to be benefactors. It was because that way they could keep an eye on the Jews when they came and went. and came for holidays. And my mother, father, sister, and I, for several years, attended Purim services at the synagogue. And when my father suggested to my grandfather one evening at our house that perhaps he ought to curtail his daily visits, because doesn't he realize that he's being watched? And as a matter of fact, he helped bake matzahs for Passover. I think a lot of his feelings for Judaism and his involvement in the synagogue was in spite of. He felt that he's going to do what he wants to do, and as he put it, in Russian of course, to hell with them. And that was his existence. What's next?
Did your family celebrate Jewish holidays in the home?
The what?
Did your family celebrate Jewish holidays in
Oh,
the home?
yes, always.
Pesach, Seders,
Sure,
okay, Purim,
absolutely,
and Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur.
of course. I did not ever get too deeply involved, but for what this may be worth, my children were fourth generation members of Shereth Israel in Dallas. I am no longer a member of Shereth Israel, and I don't want to get into the whys and wherefores, but it all stems from the way my wife's funeral went in 2008. So I am both sorry and glad for my former association and my termination of that.
But as a child in Russia, you did not have the opportunity to attend a Hebrew school or Sunday school.
There was no Hebrew school to attend.
That's
There was
what
no
I
Sunday
thought.
school to attend.
I see. Did you ever attend a Hebrew school here in Dallas?
Yes, I did for a short period of time.
Let's talk about that for a minute.
There was a guiding light in Dallas. His name was Levine. I'm sure you've heard of him. And I attended Hebrew school there. Used to ride the school bus. Got picked up at my house at 3412 Wendelkin Street in South Dallas and brought back. I'll never forget the driver. He was a black gentleman by the name of Willie. The kids loved him. There was a very close relationship with the driver, and it was interesting while it lasted.
So during those early years in Dallas, did you live in the area around Forest Avenue High School?
I lived a block away from Colonial Hill School, which was my grammar school,
I see.
my elementary school. I lived most of the time, when I was going to high school, we lived most of the time on Wendelkin Street, which is about 18, 20 blocks from Forest Avenue High School.
And when you left Russia, you went to Cuba. How long did you live in Cuba?
2.5 years.
Oh, it was a short time, very short time.
It would have been a lot longer if it wasn't for my dad's illness.
I see. Now, in Dallas, you attended Colonial
Right.
Middle School?
There was no middle
Oh,
school.
okay.
That was the
Okay.
elementary,
Grammar and
and
high
fed immediately into Forest
Forest
Avenue
Avenue.
High School.
Was it difficult for you to learn English, or did you learn the language rather rapidly?
I learned Spanish quicker than I did English.
Oh, interesting.
It seemed to get into my ears and brain rather quickly. And as you can probably tell, I'm not having much problem speaking English now. And it came rather easily. Languages are something I enjoy and appreciate.
Okay. Did you go to college?
No, I did not.
Okay. In high school, Forest Avenue High School had a large Jewish population at that time, right?
It was what?
Had a large Jewish population.
Yeah, I imagine it was about probably a third was Jewish.
That's interesting. Okay. Now, when did you become fluent in English? In elementary school? At Colonial?
At Colonial.
Okay. Did you have to study English, like English as a second language, or was it English immersion?
No, it was English immersion. I had to. Oh, interesting item. I had no one to talk to at first at Colonial. I spoke no language that anybody else spoke. And I saw a boy about my age on the school ground, and he looked Latino. I walked over to him and said something to him in Spanish. He immediately answered me in Spanish. And I felt, gee whiz, I've got somebody to talk to. And within 15, 20 minutes, I was called into the principal's office. The principal was B.W. Glasgow. And between sign language, a little bit of English, and tone of voice and everything else, I was able to understand what he was trying to tell me. That if I was ever caught speaking anything but English on school property, I would be expelled. And I would have to bring my mother or father to his office to see if I could be reinstated. Now that's the difference between then and now. The last thing I remember hearing about DISD is that there are 26 different languages spoken there at any time.
Right. Now, in your home, which language did you speak, Russian or Yiddish? As a child?
When I left Russia, my language was Russian. I understood very little Yiddish. When we came to Cuba, my maternal grandmother and one of my mother's sisters, they were waiting for us in Havana. My grandmother, in the terminology of one of my very old friends, was a going concern. Very bright woman. By the time we got there, and they lived in New Orleans at that time, she had rented an apartment for us in Havana at 86 Lamparilla. And the reason she rented that apartment, there were 8 units in that apartment, and 3 of them were occupied by Jewish families. And she figured that would be a big help to my family. Well, lo and behold, without previous knowledge of Yiddish, I started speaking Yiddish. Evidently, it was hidden somewhere in the back because I had heard it all my life. That was a big help. So it's a good thing languages have come rather easily.
Earlier you gave us information regarding your work experiences, what you did after high school with this job. I would like to ask you, I would like for us to dwell on that more now. Can you tell me about some of that work and some projects that have been most memorable to you in Dallas? I believe you owned your own business, right, Mr. Wald?
Yes, my father, in his usual wisdom, approached me after I got out of the service and went back to the job I had. Well, I was involved in my dad's business from day one because I was always doing something there. But he approached me on this basis. He said, "Why do you choose to work for somebody else?" I said, "Because our business, your business, can't support both of us." He said, "Well, would you consider the fact that with your help it probably could?" He said, "Why don't you give it a try?" He says, "You can always go elsewhere." And this is the way we started. And before I knew it, it was a 24-hour day job, which most of the time I appreciated tremendously. Really got involved, really enjoyed it, and was very successful in it.
With your dad's business?
The one that he started, yes.
And that was what? What was your dad's business?
I'm glad you asked. When my father started that business in 1935.
It's the years of the Depression.
Absolutely. Smothering depression. Before that, he was working for my two uncles, my mother's brothers. They were concessionaires. They operated concessions in hotels, nightclubs, over 50% of the United States. And my father disliked it tremendously. Just wasn't anything that interested him. But it was a must. Anyway, one of the women who worked for my uncles, I won't use any last names here. Her name was Edna. Edna made the suggestion, since she knew that my dad didn't like that business anyway. And her father, she thought, had a business. He was in the railroad salvage business. Do you know what that is? Almost all merchandise was being shipped by rail. Shipments, billions of dollars in shipments was constantly rail delivered.
Okay.
And whatever was broken, whichever shipment was damaged in shipment, the railroads didn't just pay for what was damaged in the shipment, they paid for the whole shipment. Then they sold the entire shipment that had a damage in it to people in the railroad salvage business. They, in turn, threw away the bad, had some of it repaired that was repairable, and attempted to sell what was left. Her father didn't have a business. He had a pickup truck. And every day he would go down to the railroad yards where he was well known. He would buy the damaged goods, pennies on the dollar. Sometimes it was a total loss. And then he felt that he had to sell everything that was on the truck that day because he had to have an empty truck to go back the next morning. So he discussed it with my father, and my father suggested that he needs a place where to take this stuff to. You see, this gentleman's clientele was much smarter than he was, because most of the people that he would take his pickup truck full of goods to try to sell it to them, depending on what the merchandise was, most of them would say, well, I haven't taken in any money today yet. Why don't you come at 5 o'clock this evening? And by then, maybe I'll have enough money to buy what you've got. Well, they had it all figured out. By 5 o'clock, he had to sell it for whatever he could get out of it in order to have an empty truck the next morning.
Okay, so let's get back to how how did you fit into this business with the railroad?
With the railroad salvage,
Uh-huh.
the business lasted 3 weeks. I had nowhere to fit in.
Okay, all right. Let's talk about your business.
I just have to
Okay,
tell
all right,
you
okay, all
why
right.
it lasted
Okay,
3
all right.
weeks.
Okay, let's get back to.
Because my father and I caught his partner
Okay.
stealing at night what was brought in during the
good.
day.
How-
And that was the end of that
How
business.
did you transition from your father's business to your own business in Dallas? How did you come up with this ideal? How did you?
Well, it was transitional, believe me.
Okay. Let's talk
From
about that.
railroad salvage, which lasted 3 weeks. My dad had no connection for railroad salvage. He decided, due to the area that he was in, that perhaps work clothing might be a good item. And some of our people in Dallas of our faith who were wholesalers, distributors of work clothes, decided to come to his aid. And they said, we'll support you, we'll give you credit. That's how he got into that business, which really didn't amount to much. I really got involved in it when we decided to put in a department for men's formal wear. And we became Dallas's largest rental house for men's formal wear.
Tuxedos, right?
Tuxedos, cutaways, tails, every item.
What year was that? So
1947.
47. And you became the largest in Dallas.
Yes.
And
And I didn't like it. That business was an enabler as far as I was concerned. We made enough money out of that to be able to go into what I wanted to go into.
okay, and what did you want to go into? So
Police supplies and equipment. That was my chosen field. And we supplied, in various degrees, of course, everybody from local departments, satellite departments, all the way through the federal government.
and what year did you go into the police supply business?
Well, we went into that in a limited way along with our formal wear business. And it transitioned from one into the other until in 1972, we decided to just clean house and get rid of all our formal wear and devote our time totally to police supplies and equipment.
Were you the first in Dallas to have a police supply
No.
business?
No.
Okay. Well, tell us about your police supply business in 72. Okay.
I don't know where to start, and that's odd for me. The fact is, I think our location had an awful lot to do with it. We were around the corner and a half a block away from the Dallas Police Department.
On Elm Street, right?
We were on Elm Street. At that point, the police department was at the old City Hall on Main Street. And we were constantly seeing police personnel, got acquainted with a lot of them, and a lot of the law enforcement people dropped information on me like, you know, if you had this, that, and other, we'd certainly be buying it here. Well, that was all I needed. This is what I wanted, this is what I developed. I went so far as to be deeply involved in design, research, as an example, I designed a particular holster for the Dallas Police Department that was sold the department 2,600 of them. I designed a badge case for the industry that is still being very profitably sold by a lot of people all over this end of the woods. A badge case that was adopted by everybody. We sold over 10,000 units of those. And sometimes I find it hard to believe that we also sold ammunition to the Red River ammunition plant. I told you right at the beginning that truth is stranger than fiction, and it is. And I am the proof.
And how long were you in the police supply business?
Until we sold the business in 1987.
And I'm sure you had some very memorable times during
Oh,
those years.
absolutely. It's something I wouldn't take anything for.
Let's elaborate about some of those memorable times.
Well, in the first place, I rode with units of the Dallas Police Department, Richardson Police Department. As a matter of fact, I was sort of an invited visitor everywhere at all times. When I moved into Addison after I had retired, within days I had a phone call from the department. And they said, "We understand you're living in our city now. So what are you doing?" I said, "Nothing." And they said, "Well, that's going to come to an end right now." So I got involved with helping them form Citizens on Patrol in Addison. And I became very active in that until our current chief of police in Addison came in and decided to disband it because it wasn't his idea to get it started. So when I went to see him, immediately after he disbanded the Citizens on Patrol, I said, "All I want to know from you is why." And he said, "Well, Sal, you know, it never was my deal. It was my predecessor's deal." I said, "So in other words, anything that didn't come from you isn't worth having." I said, "Does that pretty well sum it up?" He said, "Well, yeah, well, just about." I said, "Goodbye." I turned around and I walked out. I haven't been there since. So that's the way the cookie crumbles, doesn't it?
Well, most definitely.
Oh, well, during the time that I was in the police supply business, and my dad, by the way, passed away in '62. So this really took off and flourished and grew and all that afterwards. And he would have been so happy and so proud to see where it went. I also did firearms repair for 50 years. And a little bit of an odd situation. Everyone has heard of Smith & Wesson. I am a graduate of the Smith & Wesson Police Armorers School, their academy. And on the day that I appeared there for my involvement there as a student, the director of the academy met me in the hall and he says, "So it is you, isn't it? I've visited there many times." He says, "I saw your name on the roster and I couldn't imagine. Why are you here?" He said, "You've been doing this for 50 years. Why now?" I said, "I came to find out if I was doing it right." And that got written up on an internal newsletter.
Great, great.
Uh,
Mr.
it
Wald,
was interesting.
we are going to pause for a minute and I'm going to insert another cassette. Okay.
See, I told you it would take forever.
Okay. All right, let's continue. We're talking about memorable events in your business career, which has been very, very interesting. Would you like to elaborate about anything else that was remarkable or memorable in your police supply business?
Yes, there's several other things that come to mind. For instance, everyone is now familiar with bulletproof vests. We sold the city of Dallas their first 1,000 bulletproof vests. That sounds like somebody making a lot of money out of bulletproof vests. And the fact remains that 1,000 vests, in order to get a foot in the door with that product, and it was, by anyone's standards, the best in the business. We sold it at a loss. And I convinced my supplier that we should do that and he should suffer part of the loss. Because once you get into a department with a fantastic product that saves lives, you don't need to make a profit, especially on your first sale to the department. And they were so impressed with what we sold them that they had me write the specs for that particular product, which I saw certain shortcomings even in this fantastic product that we were able to improve on. And this was a constant for years. We were constantly getting more and more and more orders. And when you are dealing with a department such as Dallas, that the small departments as satellite departments, they look to Dallas because they have the ability, the manpower and all that to pick and choose and investigate. And if it's good enough for Dallas, it's good enough for us. So that led to a lot of sales because of that. And I really enjoy that business. Now, it has led to certain opinions that I have formed, and it has led to certain desires on my part, and I'm going to pass them on to anyone who might read or listen. I believe that it is very important for anyone to try to associate with as many people younger than themselves as they can, because if you associate with no one other than people your own age or older, that is going to be ultimately a detriment. And this is what kept me in touch with all the young rookie officers, and from then on. This is now 2011. I've been retired 24 years. I am still in touch with my former customers, some of them who started being a customer of ours when they became Explorer Scouts by way of the Boy Scout movement. Some of them were as young as 14 years old, and I still hear from them. I still see them. I still meet them for lunch. They bring me their kids to show off, and now their grandchildren. And this is the greatest thing that could happen to me.
What a remarkable career you've had, Mr. Wald. This is phenomenal. I'm sure you've been active in civic organizations and some Jewish organizations. As an adult, would you like to elaborate on those for a few minutes?
I can't think of any other than my involvement with municipalities on the basis of supply and demand that I would care to even talk about.
What about Jewish organizations?
The only
you-
one that I've had a
Veteran Jewish
long-term
veterans?
relationship with is Jewish War Veterans of the United States.
Okay.
And I still am a member. I've been a member for 66 years. I am a life member. And it really hurts me to see this organization dwindling. And it's dwindling because we're not getting fresh blood into it. We need younger membership. And we're trying our darndest, but not succeeding.
So you're a Jewish war veteran. Of which war? So,
World War II.
okay.
As a matter of fact, we are having an installation banquet lunch on the 23rd of this month, installing a new commander and a new crew for the next year. And I think this will help tremendously. The commander will be the youngest one we've had in years.
Let's go to the area of your immediate family information regarding your family. How did you meet your wife?
How did I meet my wife?
And
Well,
when were
this,
you married?
this is, everything you mentioned to me becomes interesting. The fact is, I probably first saw her when she was about 6 years old. Because when we lived at 1713 Cooper in South Dallas for a very short period of time, it was a horrible house. Her grandmother lived on Colonial, and their backyard sort of met our side yard at the alley that was between us. But I actually met her and became aware of her, primarily became aware of her because of her outstanding beauty. And she became my wife, and she was my wife for 62 and a half years. And I suffer the loss on a daily basis. I met her at a Saturday night temple dance at Temple Emmanuel.
In what year was this?
1944. As a matter of fact, at that time we lived at 1901 South Boulevard, the temple being at 1900 South Boulevard. We were right across the street from the temple. Oh, and what you might find interesting, Hy Perlstein, a member of JWV because I got him into it. We've been friends now for 71 years. And he and I were double dating that night in 1944. And I said, why don't we go across the street and see what's going on at the temple? They always had a temple dance on Saturday nights. Shirley at that time was going to SMU. And that's how it all began. And Shirley and I have 3 wonderful kids. And one of them lives in New Hampshire. She's married to Rabbi Edward Friedman. I have Janice is the eldest of the 3. Then Dave lives in Carrollton, and he is a computer person through and through. He is working for a company now for many, many years where he designs computer systems for them. And then there's Edwin. Edwin has always been more interested in theater than anything else, and he's back into that now after having been with several companies over the years and decided to leave all that and go back into theater. And he is in a suburb of Chicago, and that's where he is to this day. And one grandson.
Okay, that's
All we
important.
have is one grandchild. He teaches music and is an entertainer in great demand in Charleston, South Carolina.
And what is his name?
His name is Aaron Michael Levy. And my daughter Janice is on her way right now from my house to his house, even as we speak. She left this morning. She was supposed to leave on Wednesday, but she has to go through Atlanta to get there. Interstate 20 was snowbound, so she had to wait until this morning so she could get there.
What year were you married? I forgot to ask you so.
The year we were married,
Yes.
1945.
And your wife's name was Shirley, right? Your wife's name.
Sherrard,
Okay.
Sherrard.
Okay. And first name?
Shirley.
Shirley Sherrod.
Mhm.
Okay. And you had a wonderful marriage.
Yes, sir.
You belonged to a synagogue for a number of years?
Yes, she was the third generation Sheriff Israel, and our kids were the fourth.
Word out. Interesting. And you still have contacts with the Jewish community, with Jewish world veterans?
As we're witnessing right now.
I'm going to ask you some concluding questions. Who are your role models? Are your role models as you were growing up in Dallas and Dallas business? I know your business was very active during the Kennedy years. Let's elaborate on some of your role models, the people that you have admired and respected.
My role models were so many. My father, for one. When I went to work for Lion Auto Parts, Maury Polikoff's father, Sam Polikoff, who was quite up in years at that time, he decided I was the best employee they had, so he had to sort of appropriate me wherever he needed me. And on occasion I would be his driver when his arthritis bothered him, so that he wasn't secure in driving himself. And he was a wonderful gentleman with a varied background.
And what was his name again?
Sam Polikoff. And his son, Joey, for whom I worked after there was no more Lion Auto Parts, because the ownership of Lion Auto Parts was actually in Chicago. Lion Auto Parts and Manufacturing Company.
Okay.
They decided to close the Dallas operation, and Joey Polikoff was in the bearing rebuilding business, and I worked for him. And that was not a very long standing. He's the one that kept me from volunteering for the military service, because he kept saying, give me another couple of weeks. I can't get you replaced.
Indispensable, right?
Well, he thought so. And while I was trying my darndest to separate myself from Monarch Bearing Company so that I could go into the service, because in my estimation, I did not want to be drafted. That would have been stigmatic for me. So he kept stalling and stalling until I got my draft notice. And when I got my draft notice, I went to see a very high-ranking military person in this area and asked him a very blunt question after telling him the background for my feelings. I said, "Can you get my draft notice rescinded? And I will volunteer the same day." He said, "Yes, I probably can, but I won't." I said, "And the reason being," he says, "I've been in military service for all these many years, like 30. And he says, I'm going to give you the best advice I can offer. Don't ever volunteer for a goddamn thing." He says, no matter what happens to you, it's not going to be your fault if you didn't ask for it to start with. He says, but you'll always blame yourself for volunteering if something happens to you because you volunteered. He says, let nature take its course. I'm not going to do it.
We're at the point of concluding our interview, but there's one question I want to ask you, and I'm sure I know the answer already. What are you most proud of in life?
What am I most proud of? I'm very proud of the fact that evidently I have made some excellent choices through the years. I chose the right parents to start with. I chose the right wife. Evidently, I chose the right children. I chose the right business, ultimately. I actually chose having this interview. What else could I possibly hope for?
Thank you, Mr. Wald. You have brought some photos of your family, your family's history, and I would like to focus in on those photos, and if you will, you can stand or you can point, and I will focus the camera so we can include these in your interview. So this is what we're going to add as the final part of your invaluable interview today. And I'm going to focus this so I can get a closer, yeah, this is good, this is very good. Okay, let's bring it in a little closer. Okay, this item here, would you like to elaborate?
This? This is my Russian birth certificate, dated the 19th day of March 1920, in Moscow, Russia.
Let's go up to the top one here.
The top one is Hanna and Shale Greenwald. So you can see our name originally was that. It was changed for obvious reasons to Wald when we got to this country.
Okay.
And this is my father's mother and father in Russia. My father was born in Novogrudok, Russia.
Okay, let's go to this one.
Rebecca and Mitchell Blasser My mother's mother and father were born in Poland and lived in Warsaw until they came to the United States.
And this here, this.
And right there is my father and mother's wedding picture in Warsaw when the Tsar of Russia in 1905 ordered all Jews out of major cities in Russia, and they were given a choice actually. They could either leave on their own or be shipped off in cattle cars to the Russian border and dumped. So obviously they made the choice of leaving on their own.
Okay,
And that's where they met, that's where they married, and that's where my sister, who was 8 years older than I, was born. And this picture right there of my mother and father is when my mother was pregnant with my sister.
Let me get that one. Okay. Now,
This is a picture of me when I was about a year and a half old.
oh, good, wait.
1921, so I was about a year old.
Okay, this is a picture of you when you were a year old in 1921, right? This one, okay.
This was in Moscow.
Oh, in Moscow. When you were a year old, 1921. Okay.
21.
All right.
This is when I was approximately 3 years old.
Okay.
And as a sidebar to that, my mother refused to have my hair cut
Interesting.
until my father one day took me to the park by way of the barber shop. And I never saw my mother as angry about anything as she was about my haircut. But we all survived that.
Okay, and this
Now,
one?
This lady right here was Marfa Ivanovna. She was my caretaker until 19, trying to set a date over there, we left in 29, about 1926.
Okay.
Oh, digressing a bit, we attended a very, very cold procession in 1924 when Lenin died, and he was on display in the temporary mausoleum in Red Square. And my father was asked, why does he want to go to and stand in line for hours to view the body of Vladimir Lenin? And he said, the biggest reason is to make damn sure he's dead. And that's how much he liked him. He said, and aside from that, I am sure it would be good to be seen at the funeral. So that was his relationship with Lenin. Now, right here, I mentioned earlier that we used to take some vacations
Yes, I got it.
in the Crimea.
Okay.
That was, and by the way, that was a borrowed dog.
Okay.
And that was on the beach on the Black Sea,
A bar-
1924.
Okay, was that in Odessa?
No, actually it was in Simiez.
Okay. All right, let's go to this one here.
Well, let's go to, this was on the Caspian Sea vacation. This was on the Black Sea
Okay.
vacation. And this was in 1926, after I had my hair shaved because of scarlet fever. And this is my father's father,
Wait.
my grandfather, in 1927.
Let's straighten this up again. It's too diagonal. I want to get this.
Maybe you need some more depth?
No, I'm just, okay. Now, this is much better. Let me focus it. Okay, tell me who these people are now.
What's that?
Tell me who these people are.
Right here?
Mm-hmm.
My grandfather,
Shael, no?
Shale
Mm-hmm.
Greenwald, my sister, Faye,
Mm-hmm.
my mother, Lanya,
Okay,
this is I,
okay.
and my father, Aaron.
Aaron. All right, and this one?
And on that one, that was taken in Havana, Cuba,
Let me get it better.
at a beautiful garden spot owned by Cerveza Tropical, the brewery that supplied most of the beer for Havana. That was 1930.
How interesting. Let's go back to your birth certificate one more time, please. I really want to get a good shot of that. This is really historic. Totally in Russian. And would you please point, let me focus this. Here's what I want right here. It reads Saul's Russian birth certificate, 1920.
1920.
Now, point to your name on the birth certificate, and I would like to focus in on it. Okay, point to your name on the birth
The
certificate.
name on the certificate is right here.
Okay,
And for a little kid, I sure had a long name at that time.
let me focus in on that if I can get it. Okay, it's not, okay. You did have a long name.
Solomon Aronovich Greenwald.
Okay.
Now, you know where the Aronovich comes from.
No.
If you translate it into English, it would be Solomon, the son of Aaron, Greenwald.
I see. Okay.
Are
Very
you through
well.
with this?
Yes, we're finished. Okay, thank you, Mr. Wallace. I want to ask you one other question, and please have a seat, and we will end our interview. Here we go. Is there anything you would want to add at this point, Mr. Wald?
There is either nothing or so much that I wouldn't know where to start. This actually could become endless. So I think that for the sake of what we might erroneously call brevity, we might end it now on a high note.
And thank you so much, Saul Wald, for giving us the opportunity to have an oral history for our archives.
Well, I want to thank you for giving me this opportunity. I'm glad to have been able to do that after years of planning. And I hope I've satisfied your expectations.
Most definitely. And thank you again.
You're certainly
Спасибо,
welcome.
as we say in Russian. Muy спасибо. Very much thank you.